some good questions to ask an evolutionist.
It's often very important in a conversation with a critic of creation to ask the critic to define his or her terms. And so we might ask questions of clarification, such as, what do you mean by the word evolution? The word evolution can simply mean change in a general sense. It can refer to the idea that organisms have evolved over millions of years from one kind into another. It can mean the idea that organisms share a common ancestor. And so it's important that we define our terms before we begin the debate so that there's no confusion later on. We might ask, what do you mean by the word science? Science can simply mean knowledge in a general sense. It can mean knowledge acquired by the scientific method, for example. And so whether or not you classify evolution as science might depend on whether you're talking about operational science or origin science is another example. What do you mean by the word theory? Which can, in ordinary language, simply mean a conjecture, but in scientific language, it actually means something that has substantial support, something that has evidence that would confirm it. In addition to these, there are questions that we can ask to get the critic to think through his basic worldview. And so you might ask, for example, do you believe that single-celled organisms eventually evolved into more complex organisms? Yes, well, single-celled organisms reproduce by simply splitting in two, but whereas more complicated organisms, multicellular organisms, reproduce differently. They have the male and the female. And so by asking questions like that, it gets the evolutionist to start to think through some of the things that maybe he's taken for granted in the past. What about information in DNA? DNA has information, all the instructions necessary to produce you. It's a lot of instructions. Where did that information come from? Well, you see, if you read a book, well, it has information in it. You'd say, well, that information comes from a mind. Information, as far as we know, always goes back to a mind, brand new creative information. It can be copied many times, but it will ultimately have, as a source, an intelligence. And that makes sense, given what the Bible says about creation. God made those first life forms and put the DNA, the instructions in their DNA. And so it makes sense given what the Bible says, but it doesn't make sense if DNA came about by a random chance process. But ultimately, you must get back to what we might call worldview questions. And these are questions that get the critic to think about his most basic beliefs about the world, the way it is, and how it came to be. Because we're going to find that in the evolutionary worldview, you just can't account for those things that are necessary for knowledge. And so we must start asking questions about what's called epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And how is knowledge acquired? Do we go out and look at things? Is that how we acquire knowledge? Or do we do it by reasoning or some combination thereof? And why? Why is that the case? In the Christian worldview, God has made our minds, and so it makes sense that our minds would be able to acquire knowledge through a variety of different means, through thinking about it, and through observing, and ultimately through revelation from God himself. Or metaphysics, which is, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of the universe? Is the universe two? Is it one? Is it many? And so on. Now, in the Christian worldview, the universe is physical, but it's made by a God who's beyond that universe. And so that's how we would answer that question as Christians. And finally, ethics, which is how we know right from wrong. And those are very good questions to ask an evolutionist, because you see, ultimately, in an evolutionary worldview, you can't have an objective basis for morality. It's just not going to work, because there's no God. In an atheistic universe, in an evolutionary universe where things have evolved by random chance, there's no reason why you should have a moral code, why those organisms should be obligated to follow a particular code of behavior. And so, for example, I might ask, how do you know that it's wrong to lie? I mean, we would all agree that it's wrong to lie, at least generally. And why is that the case? Well, in the Christian worldview, I can make sense of that because God has told us that it's contrary to his nature to engage in lying. And so that is wrong. But in an evolutionary worldview, why would that be wrong? And so it seems that there's an inconsistency in the evolutionist worldview. On the one hand, he knows it's wrong to lie. On the other hand, he can't give a reason for why it's wrong to lie, particularly if it benefits my survival value. And so those are good questions to ask to get a person to think through his worldview. And if you're really good at asking worldview questions, you'll find that they actually end the debate, because there aren't any good evolutionary answers to worldview type questions.